Putin 2, Obama NATO 0. In a bid to strengthen the Russian air campaign, another Syrian ally China is now planning to deploy Shenyang J-15, a carrier-based fighter aircraft, in Syria. Several reports have stated that Beijing has agreed to join the Russian air campaign. The development has come mere days after Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi told a Security Council meeting that the world can no longer afford to stand by and look on with folded arms, but must also not arbitrarily interfere in the Syrian crisis. http://www.ibtimes.co.in Russia Syria Chinese J-15 fighter jets join Russian air campaign against ISIS 649,207 Shorty. After addressing the United Nations General Assembly, Russian President Vladimir Putin asked for and received a vote by the Russian parliament to begin operations to oust fanatical jihadists in Syria, most of whom were trained, armed, funded and supported by the US and its allies. The US and NATO's aim is to topple the Bashar al-Assad regime. Putin and his allies Iran, Iraq, Hezbollah and soon China have drawn a line in the sand, and indicated they will no longer stand idly by and allow the West and its Wahhabi fanatic surrogates to wreak havoc in Syria. Unlike the US and their jihadist pawns and patsies, who have been trying to destabilize and oust al-Assad for going on 5 years, the Syrian government formally asked Putin for help. Syria is a trading partner and ally of Russia, and Putin has been supplying support to al-Assad in the form of tactical intelligence, which has helped Assad's forces thwart the efforts of the US and its allies to implement regime change in Syria like they did in Libya, Iraq, Ukraine and Yemen. In its arrogance, hypocrisy and hubris, the US tried to create a no-fly zone in Syria like they did in Libya. But Putin stepped in and undermined the Americans' reason to take Assad out for supposedly gassing his citizens. Where have we heard claims like that before? Remember Saddam Hussein and WMD's Putin stepped in and convinced the Assad government to destroy all of its poison gas. Assad agreed, thereby averting what the US and its NATO thug allies did to Iraq and Libya. But that did not stop the Western imperialists. It turned out the jihadist fanatics in the employ of the US and its Western allies were the ones who used the poison gas on Syrian civilians, but in the meantime Putin was able to temporarily derail the West's crime rampage in the region. Undeterred, Obama increased US aid and support to his jihadist puppets just like the US did to Osama bin Laden in the 1980s. The US found itself giving money and support to al-Qaeda, and with a straight face called them moderate rebels. Meanwhile ISIL and a bunch of other stooges were wreaking havoc in Syria, Iraq and parts of Turkey. Their goal is to destabilize the whole region so the US and its regional allies Israel and the feckless Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates would hold sway as vassals of the West and Israelis. But Putin intervened and prevented the West from making Syria a no-fly zone. Score 1 for Putin and give Obama and the axis of evil 0. Now that Putin has sent ships into the Mediterranean Sea, set up a forward airbase in Syria and started bombing the crap out of ISIL and the other jihadists, the US is having conniptions. The corporate mind control apparatus right on cue has ratcheted its demonization of Putin, obfuscating the facts on the ground, even showing bogus footage of civilian deaths and damage, pictures that were taken hours before Russian planes ever took off on their missions. Meanwhile the US has to scramble to explain and spin the fact US and NATO airstrikes hit a hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan, killing and wounding innocent civilians, which is a bona fide war crime. Obama complaining about Russian attacks on his jihadist stooges while killing innocent sick and wounded people in Afghanistan is like the kettle calling the pot black. Putin has sent advisors, troops, planes, ships and tactical support to Syria. He is waging war from the air while Iranian, Syrian, Iraqi and Hezbollah troops on the ground do the mop-up work to roust, kill or capture ISIL and the other jihadist fanatics. Putin just dispatched his elite special ops troops to Syria. Remember how Obama and his lapdogs took it upon themselves to supposedly go after ISIL? Well, Putin has accomplished more in less than a week than the US and its allies have been able to do in years. And now China is entering the fight on the side of Assad and Syria. Chalk another one up for Putin, put down another slap at the US axis of evil. Putin is not a poser or pretender. He is a legitimate leader, who is tired of us belligerents and bullying. His actions in Syria, his restraint in Ukraine and his attempts to form a real coalition to go after terrorists are a stark contrast to the US jingoism and hypocrisy. Putin told the world, when he addressed the United Nations General Assembly last month, there has to be openness and cooperation rather than coercion. In fact, the Islamic State itself did not come out of nowhere. It was initially developed as a weapon against undesirable secular regimes. Having established control over parts of Syria and Iraq, Islamic State now aggressively expands into other regions. It seeks dominance in the Muslim world and beyond. Their plans go further. The situation is extremely dangerous. In these circumstances, it is hypocritical and irresponsible to make declarations about the threat of terrorism, and at the same time turn a blind eye to the channels used to finance and support terrorists, including revenues from drug trafficking, the illegal oil trade and the arms trade. It is equally irresponsible to manipulate extremist groups, and use them to achieve your political goals, hoping that later you'll find a way to get rid of them or somehow eliminate them. I'd like to tell those who engage in this, gentlemen, the people you are dealing with are cruel, but they are not dumb. They are as smart as you are. So, it's a big question, who's playing who here? The recent incident, where the most moderate opposition group handed over their weapons to terrorists, is a vivid example of that. We consider that any attempts to flirt with terrorists, let alone arm them, are short-sighted and extremely dangerous. This may make the global terrorist threat much worse, spreading it to new regions around the globe, especially since there are fighters from many different countries, including European ones, gaining combat experience with Islamic State. Unfortunately, Russia is no exception. Now that those thugs have tasted blood, we can't allow them to return home and continue with their criminal activities. Nobody wants that, right? Russia has consistently opposed terrorism in all its forms. Today, we provide military technical assistance to Iraq, Syria and other regional countries fighting terrorist groups. We think it's a big mistake to refuse to cooperate with the Syrian authorities and government forces, who valiantly fight terrorists on the ground. We should finally admit that President Assad's government forces and the Kurdish militia are the only forces really fighting terrorists in Syria. Yes, we are aware of all the problems and conflicts in the region, but we definitely have to consider the actual situation on the ground. Go to http The Saker is on 70th General Assembly Live Vladimir Putin's speech, to read the full text of Putin's on speech. Putin told it like it was for the whole world to see. Things are looking up for Assad, but the banksters and warmongers in New York, Washington, London, Tel Aviv and Riyadh are not liking these developments one bit. But there is little they can do about it, because the Syrian government invited Putin to come, and then help his beleaguered forces maintain order. Keep in mind al-Assad was overwhelmingly re-elected in 2014 by his people, even in the midst of a backed attempt to oust him. Obama and his handlers talk about Assad violating the human rights of his people. How can Obama say anything to anyone about human rights violations? He is the mad bomber using drones and missiles to kill innocent civilians in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya and Syria. What about Obama reigning over the largest gulag system in the world? What about the indigenous North American people the US government still keeps locked up in concentration camps they call reservations? What about Ferguson? What about the systemic racism that is endemic within US culture? Don't depend on the corporate mind control apparatus for your news about the world, seek other sources. Don't believe the hype about Putin. While he is no saint, he's not the Hitler the Western press is painting him out to be. Remember that top US industrialists and bankers financed and backed Adolf Hitler and his fascist regime in Germany. The Russian people made major sacrifices during WWII, and were the real reason the Allies won the war. The US press is dogging Putin just like they dogged Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr. and anyone else who decides he or she is no longer going to go along with the 1%s and their flunkies okey doke. So if you're keeping score on Syrian situation, it's Putin, sovereignty and peace 2, Obama destabilization and the warmonger 0.